Okay, here we are for another Pat Zalewski interview or video cast. This one's number 5 called GD Spirituality. I'm Martin Thibeault and I'm here with Pat Zalewski in his home in Cairns, Australia in November 2022. And so let's get right into it.
Sure.
So, Golden Dawn Spirituality. You're known for being pragmatic and very intellectual in your approach to the system. So what would you say from a spiritual standpoint? What's the purpose of the Golden Dawn?
Well, I think you got two choices on this. You can see how it was done in England, and then you can see how it was done in New Zealand. Was there any changes? And there were differences between the two. The first thing in England, as far as I'm aware, they weren't as religious as far as bringing religion into the GD. The GT was unique. It was a standalone concept in its own right. You could put very, very many different people coming in like Crowley and Bennett, and it would work even for as far. The problem is when you look at the New Zealand side of it, slightly different take. And I can appreciate both because I sort of came through both levels. Not that I was in the UK in 1880, but I went in a similar track to it because my early mysticism came through taking on yoga, tantric yoga, a little bit of Buddhism on top of that, and Tai Chi, which was Taoism, partly Taoist philosophy as well. So when I came to New Zealand and I met the people from Whare Ra, they were a Christian group, there's no doubt about that. But let's go back and look at, I can speak with some insight into the New Zealand side of it, so I'd rather start there rather than get back into the GD, which Tony Fuller would probably be able to answer a hell of a lot better than I am on this question as far as the English side of it. When the order started in New Zealand, there was a small group of people, they were Quakers, and they were a very rich group, and Havelock North, a small village in New Zealand, started by Harold Large. And they were religious. And a Murfield father came out, Church of England, and they decided, okay. He said, look, I can help you. They wanted to go in a new direction, but they weren't too sure where to go. They had doubts. So the deal was that he put them in touch with Dr. Falcon. I think it was Bishop Selwyn, I think it was, from memory. I have to look that up. He was 8-3 in the SM. So he was quite... Anyway, so to cut a long story short, Falcon came out, met the people. They liked what they saw of him. Falcon saw a way out of the UK and about 1912 gave an initiation into the people, then left. Now, when between 1912 and 16, 17, when he came over, the GD was, or as we'll call it, it was interlaced with Christian ethics. How they quite did that, I'm not sure. But what they did was they looked at the Old Testament aspect of it. So the Hebrew mysticism in it was not a separate Jewish mysticism to them, it was just simply Old Testament, which is part of the Bible. So that was never an issue or a problem for them. So when they came in, they decided to use the religious side of it to help explain things. And Mrs. Falcon was forever quoting St. Paul. She came into it, and a lot of the people, my friend Percy Wilkinson from Whare Ra, he was a lay teacher. Frank Salt was the son of a preacher. Jack was religious too. So they're all steeped in religion, but they produced a syncretic construct of how this worked with religion and the Golden Dawn. Now, just because they did it at Whare Ra doesn't mean it was the only way to go. When I came in, to a point, I'd pretty much left behind Catholicism, and I was very steeped in the Indian concept. Mm-hmm. So I was a bit like, even though I hadn't read Theosophy, but I was going in that slight direction of bringing the Indian concept into things. So when I got there, I can see my reaction to all of this was very, very simple. It was a separate standalone concept. And in the England and in Whare Ra and myself as a separate entity, you become co-creator of what you do. You're not bringing in something that's totally isolated. when you invest in that concept, the GD concept, you become co-creator. So if you're a Christian, you will expand that. If you're a pagan, you will expand that influence. Because the only way this really started was Dr. Falcon, who in New Zealand, simply because he could be, according to the words of the Hermes Temple chief, he could be a pagan to all pagans or Christian to all Christians. He could be all things to all people. So there was no real issue or problem with him at the helm, and he endowed that philosophy. So
he didn't push any of his personal things into.
Oh, he was very religious. He was used to, in a harvest festival, he used to read the Bible and things. He was well known as a strong Christian. There's no doubt about that. But he could be all things to all people. So that was an interesting point.
So with a certain flexibility, he had his own strong beliefs, but was able to adapt to the.
Yeah, the flexibility was there. But what I'm trying to say is that you can have the GD. You don't have to make it Christian. You don't have to make it pagan. You can make it whatever you want, because you've got that co-creator aspect. When you're co-creator of something, your own experiences come into that and help you create what you're going to extrapolate from the knowledge and rituals you do.
Do you feel that someone, let's say, who doesn't have a religion or who is looking for a religion could use the GD as a substitute? Do you think the GD can actually fully substitute as one's religious practices and beliefs?
I'm pretty sure of it. I mean, say Crowley had a strict Quaker upbringing too, but he left that behind well and truly. He adopted it and he used that as a vehicle. The GD is a vehicle. There was a very strong sense that the GD is not a schoolboy thing where you sit down there and write things out and do lessons, and it was not a religious thing. It was a bridge between all the worlds. And because human beings as they are, they have their own ideas. When they come in and they take this abstract concept, which is not really abstract because you have biblical references all the way through it, but because it's Old Testament, it's really pushed back from the Christian side of it. You don't really look at the Christian side of it until you get into the 5-6 where you find out that they call that Yehoshua, But the reality is that if you go into the GD like they did at Whare Ra, they could take on the Christian side, they could take on the pagan side. I know people who are very pagan went into the GD and had a great time. So it's just one of these things that you change to suit your own value system. So the biggest issue in the GD has always been a value system, and that's what you're trying to create. To understand the philosophy of the GD, you have to have a value system. And your value system is technically your own. So there are variances there. You can't just go back and say, well, so-and-so Mathis said this, Moena said this, Brody Innes was a Christian, Carnegie Dix was a Christian, he said this. It just doesn't work that way. You're looking at purely hermetically sealed philosophical constructs. But when you put your thought into it and when you put your act into it, you become co-creator. And that hermetically sealed concept that you are given then is extrapolated where you pick the ball up and run with it in your own direction. That's why you have so many variances. Dion Fortune went all pagan, for example. Rigardi went into psychology, and he was not really religious at all. Oh, he liked things that were Jewish and liked to hang around people sometimes that were Jewish, but that was about as far as it went, I think, as far as I'm aware.
Do you think that there's any religions or religious beliefs that are more harmonious with the system, and do you think that, and do you feel that some are completely incompatible?
No, I think they're all pretty much the same and the same benefit. But as I said, if you come on with an area of the GD that's not compatible with your own, that's not compatible to standard religious practices, you'll bring your own interpretation to it. Now, your own interpretation expands and contracts. Like Frank Salt, he saw the GD in religious terms. I knew people that trained under Frank. Tony Fuller and Cas Mills would probably give you a better insight into me than I would, but my two friends, Barbara and Ian Nairn, they were trained under Frank Salt. And they know how that worked, and they told me all about it. They trained under him in the 50s. Jack and Frank Salt were both from Napier, and they were up for the job of Damon Strato, and Frank was the inside grad, and he got it from Jack. Not that anyone was less than the other, but it's just the way the system worked. It's like any other system. It's like electing a pope. You got your pro and pro fours and against.
No, but it's an interesting and it's a kind of a provoking thought too, that you feel there's no religious approaches that are incompatible with the system. I'm not saying I agree or disagree. I'm just it's an interesting topic, this, because let's say, for example, someone comes and claims to be a full-blown Satanist, just an example, right? Do you feel that their belief structure will conflict with the system or not, or that they're going to end up finding those religious bits through the system, like you're saying, like basically co-creating that?
Well, you're looking at everything as Lord of the universe, and the archangels. Satan was an archangel, or he was an angel. He was must have been an archangel. So you've got that variability in there. I don't think too many Satanists have got into the GD. They might have turned Satanists afterwards, probably due to frustration with the GD teachings at times, or with their teachers. But yeah, a Satanist, to a certain extent, could function that way. But what he would do to that, to bring his own interpretation, he or she, or them and their, as awake people have it, would they would get to the point where they would say, okay, they would pick something up and run with it in their own particular direction.
Right, turn the adorations into the Lord of the universe as whatever their conception of the Lord is.
You can make anything stand up and bark if you've got the intellect and the structural ability, cohesiveness to put that together. The GD was wide open in some areas, but because it was biblical and Old School Testament, it was really a step back from Christianity. But the old-fashioned biblical aspect. But Mrs. Falcon brought in the Christian, very strongly Christian tones, as did Dr. Falcon, and she was quoting St. Paul when doing a ritual analysis, as Frank did as well. So makes salt. Jack would never do that, though. He never quoted old
scriptures
like that. He would. Jack was a structuralist, just like me. He liked to see things out, but it's the value system that you've got within you, and when you come to the Golden Dawn, you put your own take on it. That's the way it is. That's your indeterminacy, a factor to it. Now, we had people screaming that, I think I went into this before, willy-nilly, oh, you can't have it that way. Well, that's exactly what it's designed for. If you want to really have a good look at it.
Well, it's good. It means that it's flexible, it's inclusive, it's open-ended. The possibilities are there.
Well, yeah, and there's different approaches to it. To doing it. The one is where you there's different approaches. Well, one of the approaches is that you study diligently and it will come, which I'm convinced that is true if you be fair about it on yourself. The other is that you end up seeing God now like St. Paul on the road to Damascus. So those are the two elements. One's a lightning flash and the other one is a gradual empathy associating, and both will produce different value systems. I can't say I've had any lightning flashes. I've had a few minor ones, but not.
It's sometimes referred to as Gnosticism versus Pisticism, the faith versus experiential knowledge, right?
Yeah.
So what about other occult systems? So, like Mathers in Ritual A in the General Orders, he's got this paragraph in there where he's talking about against the HBFL.
Okay, well, before we go now, let's get back to Rigardi.
Okay.
Rigardi was really a non-Jew Jew. He was respectful of the Order's teaching. He was respectful of Judaism, but he didn't want to believe in it. When it came to Christianity and JC, Rigardi told me point blank, he said there was no such person as JC. And he said there's no such person. Walked away, he was in a bit of a huff. But that was his point.
Not that matters, but yeah.
No, it does, because what I'm trying to say is that when Rigardi went into the GD, even though he had his Jewish background up to a point, he was really going in for a little bit of Crowleyana, certainly. That rubbed off on him without any doubt, beyond any shadow of a doubt. But he looked at things psychologically. So he took the emotional empathy with God out of the situation, because he looked at it from a psychological viewpoint. Now, a lot of people will say he didn't, but I sat down and talked to him. I know he did. He told me that more or less in words. I sat down with him. He was in Wellington for a couple of weeks, I think. And we talked every day at my place. So there's nothing that I left untouched if I could. I did my best to ask him a whole lot of questions. But I saw his reaction to what I was saying, and everything came down to psychology. Well, in psychology, there's really no real God, is there? They're just analysing what's there, an abstraction. Well, that's the way Rigardi thought. And a lot of people...
Did he consider himself agnostic? Or?
Oh, he was never totally... He was good at the Hebrew, pronunciation of the Hebrew, and he was proud of his Jewish heritage. But did he delve into Jewish philosophy other than the Kabbalah and an interest in it? But did he believe it fully? He switched all the time. When we discussed this, he went back to psychology. We talk about the tree of life, and we talked about the grades. And every time, when they get to a certain level in the ego rises, and he went on to a Kabbalistic concept. So that's how they did it, and that's how a lot of people do it. That's standard procedure. That's the way the GD set up. You go into a system, it doesn't have Christianity right at the beginning. It's got the Jewish things, which is removed from most people. So they see that as an Old Testament, something in the distant. They can recite that and not worry about it. But when they start getting into the inner order, things alter a little bit. So what happens is they bring in the archetypal God forms, which compensate for anything like that. But you're still looking at angels and archangels and things, which is really Hebrew mysticism. That book on Bamaji, which we discussed some time ago, that gives you examples of that. You can look at negative and positive in it. But the philosophy of the GD, as you see it yourself, is part of your creation, the way you want to see it. The philosophy of the GD as an abstraction is a totally different ballgame.
So along those lines, because you brought up Rigardi and obviously an influence from Crowley, something that comes up a lot in the GD community on forums, and it's a constant subject of debate, is whether or not something like Thelema is compatible with the GD system. And obviously, from what you seem to be saying, it doesn't matter one religious paradigm or another. What you bring to it, you'll essentially adapt to yourself.
Well, let's backtrack a little bit. Most people in the GD who want to take on a Christian state or go biblical, Old or New Testament, doesn't really matter so much. They're doing that as a form of protection from some idiot getting there and bringing all sorts of satanic cults or something of the equivalent of. Not that Satanists are negative, it just means they have a skewed belief the way a certain thing goes. It's not mine. But I think the concept of these particular people who have these particular beliefs, they really, the whole thing really is to protect the GD. So what you have is all these additional beliefs around the periphery that you can bring in. You know, I studied Celtic and Nordic symbolism to try and see how that would fit in with the Kabbalah, and the Celtic being Irish as a specific, and I enjoyed doing that. I imbibed myself into Irish myth and looking at it, Cuchulainn and things like that as Tippereth. There were all sorts of things you could do, and I enjoyed that. And I looked at this pagan and said, when you do a tarot card, you don't really have too many Christian aspects to it, except if you want to bring in the Holy Grail. Now that is another story in itself. The Holy Grail, the Grail Hallows and things like, which is really about Arthurian and mystery, that came in and that gave a very, very strong intermediate aspect. It was Christian, but it wasn't, at the same time. And people use that. And that's one of the reasons that the Order of the Table Round functions so well, because they bring in that Holy Grail. And then the Christian Bible and the Old, more so the Old Testament, I think, is riddled in allegory. It's all over the place in parables, etc., like that. You got that New Testament as well as Old. And when you get to when you get to that concept, parables and things like that, well, you can put your own spin on it. Parables for you, put your own spin on things. Now, the biggest issue we have in the GD is people who are dogmatic and say it's literal and they won't budge from what the written word is. Mrs. Falcon was a little bit like that. She wouldn't change anything in the rituals or whatever, very rarely anyway. But the point being is that because you...
almost making the initiations like sacramental or something, you know?
Yeah, if you looked at Thelema, is Thelema compatible with the GD? the biggest problem is the book of the law, because what you're doing is you're creating you've got one set of values, your own values, then you've got the value of the order that you're connecting to, whether it's the Lima or whether it's the Golden Dawn, and then you take those two value systems and go to a third. So things get a little lopsided. The trick is...
How's that different, say, in the Satanic Bible for a Satanist?
Well, I've never read the Satanic Bible. I have simply no idea what one looks like unless you read LaVey's book, and that's all the Nokiana, which means that I'm on the way and the wrong track.
Right.
But you're bringing in two sets of value systems. I think people could do Buddhism and do the GD. Could they do Thelema? Yes, I think they could, because Crowley's already embedded the rituals into the AA. Mm-hmm. So it's there anyway, up to a point. It's a question of degree. It's simply a question of how much you want to bring in and how much you want to leave out. Right. And that's the problem with the value system. You might have the same overall viewpoint, but your degree of dedication may not be the same degree as somebody else's. And that's a big issue, because when I went up to Whare Ra, I found there were gifted people at ritual. They could run rings around me, but when it came to the study side of it, they didn't see that it was a study side of things to do. That was, you had to look at the rituals, interpret the rituals in your own way. So the core factor of the value system at Whare Ra was to do the rituals, experience the rituals, write about the rituals, integrate with the rituals, and use that experience in your own daily life. That was the core system of how that worked. And I'm pretty sure that would apply in some areas of the GD as well, in England, for that matter. Today, in modern GD temples, I have simply no idea. But I don't maintain that people be Christians or non-Christians. That's up to them. But you've got to... Dion Fortune made the point that the name of Christ, for example, has power. I know that. I know that from personal experience. Mm-hmm. And because a name has power, you can use it. But the problem is, though, that when you bring in a name, people associate everything associated to that name. Yeah, and this is where the things go askew. So your interpretation of the name of Christ or Jehoshaphat may be one thing, but then another person would come in and would probably adopt the whole New Testament and bring that in with it.
And I guess it's okay to do it on a personal level and use the GD to enhance one's personal religious experience, but not to carry this kind of scriptural religious thing into the group setting, because then you're imposing a religious paradigm on other people.
Well, this is right. This is the big argument Jack and Frank had. Jack and Frank didn't like each other too much. I got on well with both of them, but really, they didn't like each other much at all, for various reasons I won't go into on this. But one of the big arguments was happening was Frank was teaching at Napier, and he was doing biblical lessons to explain the different levels of outer order grades. Mm-hmm. But one or two of the people that were in that were also in the OTR. I think they were in order as well. In order, yeah. They came and I saw Jack, and Jack said, "Well, let's do something." And they got together to do a pentagram or a hexagram ritual, which is in the OTR. So they're high up, and he looked at it. He said, "Hey," he said, "what are you doing?" And so Jack disagreed with what Frank was teaching. He said, "What was he teaching you?" And so Jack cracked up and taught them differently. And Jack went to Mrs. Falcon and complained about Frank teaching biblical stuff with that intensity rather than letting it happen. Well, this is a story from Jack.
Yeah.
And I got that not only from Jack, I got that from two people who were under Frank at the time, the Nans. They told me the same thing, and they found it very, very difficult. Frank wasn't easy to, my hat's off to Tony and Kazmillis. Frank was very good at what he did, had mapped out a lot of good stuff on the American system and stuff like that. But at one point in time, probably in the early 50s, he was teaching very heavily into the biblical side of things more than the order side of things. Mm. And that's where the complaints started to come. So Jack...
Understandably so.
Yeah, so Jack went to Mrs. Falcon and complained that Frank was teaching biblical stuff and not the order basic teachings. And so Frank turned up at Jack's place, and I really don't know what happened, but it was a bit of a ding-dong going on there over it. And something happened with Frank. He got the huff or something. Anyway, I don't really know anything beyond that. The only thing I do know was that At one point in time, Frank did teach that. Another point in time, he did not. So I don't know. Jack certainly wasn't any angel by any stretch of the imagination. He would go off into the never never as well. But this affected what Jack thought was a belief structure. So did it mean anything? Frank was just going with what he believed was right. That was his belief structure, his Christian perspective, and Jack was a strong Christian as well, but he didn't want to put Christianity into certain parts of the order. He pulled back from it. So there were disagreements there. And what I'm saying, the disagreement between Jack and Frank over this particular teaching method, you could multiply that by times 10. That would have happened all through the orders. And it was a big question. How far do you go?
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter. It didn't matter. Frank's really not wrong here, neither is Jack. They were just putting their own indeterminacy factor of what should go in and what should not go in.
As long as the students understand that it's a very subjective thing for them,
They
right?
didn't. That's the problem.
Yeah. And so let's carry that same train of thought into other occult systems, because it's one thing to bring in your own religious thing, but let's say someone's so what I was going to quote is Ritual A, right? General Orders. Mathers has a passage in there where he's forbidding, being part, say, of the HBFL. He's referring different organizations that are not compatible with the Second Order. What's your take on that? Is it?
Of course, Theosophy was compatible to the GD and the Second Order, very much so. The trouble is, if you went into Theosophy and the Second Order,
you don't think he was referring to the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor?
well, I couldn't really say on that, because you'd have to look at the correspondence going back and forth between them.
Because he does point out certain ones that he finds are compatible, and then points out other ones. But for me, that's always been a bit of a tricky paragraph, because then you're...
That's his own belief structure.
Yeah, exactly. But it's coming through in an official document.
But this is where the problem occurs. Rigardi was plumb and centre responsible for this. There's official documents and unofficial documents, according to Rigardi. At Whare Ra, never happened. You were given out certain documentation, and if you're given something, it was official. So what you had someone in one place like Havelock North giving out documentations for, say, a 4-7 grade. Then you would have someone in Taradale giving out documentation for 4-7 grade.
But surely Ritual
they may not be compatible.
But Ritual A, I mean, that's where all the exams are listed, the catalogue of...
You're assuming that that's the way it happened for Arrow. It did not happen that way. Half the people never got half the stuff. Try to find... I know the Nans had a devil of a job trying to get all the information. They never got it all from Frank either. They had to go and look for other people. They were friends of Archie Shaw's and Ewan Campbell. So what they did in certain cases, they asked them, and you got two different answers from them. So Ewan Campbell was in the I think it was in the OTR, and so was Archie Shaw. Barbara Nan remembers vividly during the old OTR ritual they had, and all of a sudden a possum got loose. The possums in New Zealand are very deadly things. You don't keep near it. And he happened to have a spear, so he's probably doing the Grail Hello ceremony. And there was Archie Shaw, who was a former chief of Whare Ra, or chief at the time, saying, "Here, puss, 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 puss," prodding this possum, trying to get it out of the halls. I think it finished the ritual. So, yeah. But the thing is, though, that...
are there incompatible occult systems?
No, I think they are, but it's going to depend on the individual. They're abstract. Mm-hmm. They're biblically abstract and referring to the Bible. So there's an Old Testament bent on it. We know that for sure. The Christian side of it's another story completely in itself. When I came up there, I'd spent time in India. I went to Nepal. I did some mantras with the monks up there, visited some of the old monasteries, because the time I was in Nepal, I think they'd only got out of, it had been 10, 15 years, I can't remember exactly, that they left Tibet and came to Nepal. And some of the big monasteries, there were houses. And they used to have all this sort of stuff. They'd have drawings and mandalas and on the floor and make you create them and chanting. You know, I was sitting chanting in front of a stupa once, and they all thought that some German people behind us thought I was nuts, sitting down there in a pair of jeans and a thick coat. The others are sitting down there in just robes, chanting Om Mani Padme Hum about 100 times. You know. that was different. But my interpretation of when I first come here, I left pretty much the Christian side of things behind. I was trained as a Catholic, altar boy, the whole thing. So I went through the whole role. And when I read the life of Milarepa, it was like there was a curtain just parted and I saw the other side of it. And I was glad that I did. But when I get into the inner order, I started to see things differently because they're using God-formed names. And Regardie, in his inner order, though he was Yehoshua, he would call Christ, I think of Christ as more of a mystical myth, a creation, a holographic concept, which is what I want to get into in a minute. If you understand Talbot's Holographic Universe book, where all the beliefs that you've ever got come into a hologram, and you can draw that out of those beliefs, out of the hologram, and take them on. The GD was like that. You could go in and pull out what you wanted to pull out. It could be tarot, it could be mythology, it could be a bunch of stuff. Enochiana. You could pull that out. But you're pulling out from individual holograms contained within a massive super hologram. Hologram means that you have a connection to a belief structure. And Talbot made the point, he said, if you don't believe in if you get enough people who believe in the Virgin Mary will appear. I think that was his take on it. And that's basically how the hologram works. If you have a belief in something, even if it's not real, I'm not saying the Virgin Mary is not, but even if it's not real, people will believe in seeing it. And that's how Regardie looked at it a little bit too. He would, although he didn't use the term hologram, he was a little bit pointed in that direction. I don't think he fully made the leap because it really wasn't at that time that we weren't discussing these things, apart from Jung, collective unconscious. But people draw from it whatever they want. So what I did, my take on it, was when I put it all together, I would look at something as a level. I would look at the Golden Dawn as a holographic with a whole lot of levels to it. And I would pull the tray or the level out that I wanted for the time and then put it back in when I finished with it. That was how I worked it. And my value system meant that I could sit down there, look at a pagan god, look at a Christian god, look at an archangel, and I wouldn't see any real difference except the functionality of which the way we're using it. If I looked at a tarot card, I would look at a mythology to explain it. If I wanted to invoke something, I would do that too. So I just pulled out what I wanted to use because I had a syncretic construct with the Golden Dawn, and that's from going to India and learning all this stuff, Taoism, the works. So for me, it was not just the order teachings and the rituals, it's what happened internally inside you. And the Christian belief doesn't really get into that too much. The Jewish or the Kabbalistic soul goes into that to a point. Blavatsky, in her work on auras and things like that, covers it as well. But the Golden Dawn doesn't. And that's part of the problem. That's one of the reasons that Mathers probably decided that he didn't want to people to study that, because they were bringing in so many new different concepts. Falcon was studying the chakras, so was Crowley, so was Florence Farr. They're all fully aware of them, yet you won't find them in the Golden Dawn. In the SM you will, but you won't find it in the Golden Dawn proper. You'll find analogies to them, what they're referring to if you want to look at it hard enough. But again, you've got to have a value system where everything integrates with everything else. You can't just say, oh, something's negative, I'm not going to look at it. I think you owe it to yourself to look at it and see what you're not supposed to be doing. If someone's talking about the devil or something like that as a negativity, they've got to explain who the devil is and what it is and what you've got to look for to avoid the devil. It's just one of these things. Using astrology, psychiatry, or psychology, for want of a bit, even more, you could bring all these things together and understand them. Now, I bring in alchemy. I look at alchemical aspects of it as well, which a lot of people don't. I look at just looking at the 4 stages or 3 of alchemy in the colours, black, red and white, or black, red, yellow and white. And they have certain meanings as well. So once you have these meanings, you can use them to suit yourself.
Yeah.
But I don't see anything as sacred. Do I tell people not to read other books? No. I say, go and read everything you want. And I say to people, if I teach you something and you can do a better job, do it. Change it. So I say, my interpretation is my interpretation. And being a human being, we have limitations to what our ability to see things. So I say to them, if you're going to change my work, what I do, make it better. Don't equal it, make it better. So, and make it stronger. So I have no objection to people coming in and changing say, Zalewski was wrong, if they have a good enough alternative to do that. And I'm going into areas now where people had never even publicly gone into them before, maybe individually in some areas, but certainly not.
So here's a tricky question. Then, well, I don't know if it's tricky, but not from the point of view of the UK, not from the point of view of New Zealand. From your point of view, if there is one, what's the ultimate goal of the GD from a spiritual perspective?
Well, is to there's a couple of ways you can look at this. You can use Mathes's approach. There's no part of me is not of the gods.
Mm-hmm.
You can use that one. But I think the whole idea is spiritually developing your internal spiritual mechanism within you, using symbols and signs and dramatic ritual as a guide, and meditation, of course. You bring all of that together, and you develop within you not only a curiosity to study other things, but a curiosity to be better at what you do. We all make mistakes, we all stumble. That's why we leave one thing and go to another, because we can see a better opportunity. But my way is just my way, and I've told people that from work down. I said, look, what I'm showing you in the correspondence course, for example, I said, this is the way I see it. As I said, you find a better way, and it's better, I stress the word better, than you use it. But I'm going to show you what I did and how I evolved. So the correspondence course is really an evolvement for what I did into how I see things now. And I'm continually changing. I'm working every day on the GD. I'm continually looking at things, changing things, altering things, being more perceptive in certain areas than I have been, looking at my mistakes and thinking, oh shit, what have I said? But that's the way of it. But then the problem you've got, while this is fluid, you've got the people that say, no, it must be this because the document said this. Mm-hmm. It must be this because Mathis said it. That's your problem. Your problem is not people like me or the people that want to do the audit. The problem is people saying you have to do everything a certain way without any variance whatsoever at all. That's the hard issue, because what happens then is that stifles your creativity and ritual. It doesn't mean you go holus bolus and do whatever you want, but you've just got to concentrate on what you're given. If you concentrate on what you're given and you're looking at, say, a particular diagram, that doesn't mean to say you can go willy-nilly into anything else. It just simply means that you've got to look what the diagram means, then take what the diagram means and look at the self, then apply the diagram to say that if you're looking at ritual, look at the tarot card. All diagrams and rituals relate to the tarot in one shape or form. Nothing more than the Kabiri in the judgment card is better illustrated, because the Kabiri, because each officer represents one of the Kabiri in the judgment card of Shen. So that what they do, they're acting out the cards. Now this is something I've never seen really in print. I put it in print, but I haven't seen anything beforehand that anyone else has done, which is more the pity. I don't want to be a lone wolf standing out there saying, look at there, look at there. I would rather other people get to a certain point where they can see what I'm seeing. Even though I have my own viewpoint, there are certain things that are very blatantly obvious. It's a bit like dog's balls on a cat. You did see, you know what it is. And the Kabiri illustrates you're representing the card. So what happened with math? There's another one with that as well. You look at the universe card. So when you have the universe card, which is in the 2-9, you also have something before that. You have the heptagram, and you also have the table of Schubert, which is 7 and 12. And you take that from the
110,
yeah. You take that from one area and in the path of Tao, and you put it into Yeso. That's how you do that. And so when you look at the figure of the universe, you've got the path of Tau superimposed over the cards. So that's repeated. See, there's a pattern there in the cards and the offices. Then you look at portions of the card and you look at the diagrams and there's a relationship there. You just got to be able to see what it is. It's all there. It's all inclusive. So when you start looking at things like that, you just find yourself in a situation where you go with what you've got.
Yeah, so I suppose what you're pointing out ultimately is the same problem that's been in most organized religions. Is the moment people get dogmatic with material, dogmatic with teachings, they become very black and white with it. That's where you essentially limit the system.
That never happened at Never. People went off the reservation a couple of times. Some of Frank's stuff was like that in one period of his life, but certainly not in all. Tony said to me that Frank had investigated many, many aspects of the GD, written very well on them, had a good grasp of, which I don't doubt for a second. But people evolve, even high teachers, with their teachings, and what they are at one year is not what they are 10 years later. They all develop and they have a slightly different viewpoint. My viewpoint's changed enormously since I've written stuff. They could come up and say to me, "Oh, you wrote that in your book?" I said, "Yeah, that was 30 years ago. I think I've developed a bit more since then." That's one of the reasons why I'm updating some of my books at the moment. We're working, for those who don't know, we're working with Martin, and we're creating that alchemical book on GD rituals, being twice the size of the original. We're working on it now. And we're going right into some very, very interesting stuff, especially Splendor Solace, which is going to be done in detail. I've covered a lot of this in a correspondence course years ago, but I'm not presenting correspondence course aspects into the book. But what I'm producing is just pertinent points to look at.
Yeah, that's actually our next interview. We're going to get into the correspondence course, why you started it, what it's made up of, and so on and so forth. But we'll definitely get into that. I guess one last thing is the outer order ultimately is in place to build up adepts, right? Or initiate people into adeptship. Well,
in theory, yes.
Yeah. So what constitutes an adept?
Well, there's, in the general sense of the word, it's one thing. It means being a master of having not mastery, but having knowledge of a certain thing, and being able to take that knowledge and improvise with it and utilise it. It means you're good at something. It's like the old saying, he's adept at something. Mm-hmm. You'll be adept at being a mechanic or driving a car, whatever the case may be. In a Golden Dawn, the word adept, totally different meaning. See, you've started on a journey in the outer order that involves bolstering your viewpoints, whether pragmatic or not, towards a certain end. When you go into the GD, you do more practical work than what you do in the outer order for a start. So you get used to doing rituals of talisman, some might do evocation, invocation, astral projection, astral work, investigating the squares, a whole pile of things. And in the problem you've got with what constitutes an adept is that in the 5-6, say they're adept at 5-6, you get someone goes into the 5-6 or NOM, whichever way you want, the first level of the 5-6, and they're in it for probably about 12 months and they quit. Then you get someone who's been in the 5-6 for something like about 10 years. The knowledge between the two levels is great. Mm-hmm. So one is an adept when they get initiated, and another one's an adept when they've just been in it for so many years and haven't gone much further.
And they're both a minor adept, yeah.
Yeah, that's where the adeptus minor. Some of them may go on. I think an adept, a lot of it is internal mastery of the self. A lot of it's your own clock as far as spiritual development goes, using your own meter. I get that thrown at me, and I sort of balk at it. Pat Zalewski, the adept from New Zealand or Australia, whichever way to look at it, but I never say that. I went through the ceremonies, and I'm still learning and trolling the ground like everyone else does. The difference between me and a lot of other people, I just keep at it. I'm 74 now, and I've been at it for a long time. And if depending on how many more years I've got left, I'm still going to be at it when I go toes up. So I'm happy enough to keep doing that. I've got my own additional personal religious systems separate from the GD that I rely on.
I mean, you've been in the system since around what, 75 that you started studying?
Oh, 70, no, it was probably a little later than that, probably 78.
78. That's 44 years.
And I'm still learning. I make lots of mistakes, and there's some things I still learn.
Oh, you never stop. I see you go. It's inspiring, but you're intense. You're just ongoing, just breaking stuff down and analyzing.
Well, writing for the forum, I'm doing some very intense stuff in there, and sometimes it falls on deaf ears, but that's okay. I put it out there for people to use. That's the idea behind it. So if it falls on deaf ears, it does. But hopefully a lot of people will be able to use it. If not now, maybe 10, 15 years' time.
Oh, well, let's keep some of that stuff for, the next one. We'll get into the correspondence course and a lot of what you've developed and how you innovate with the system. But I think we've covered a lot with the GD spirituality. I mean, went into the religious aspect, the compatibility with different systems, and we got to hear your views on the spiritual development.
But just on a last note, I see it as a whole. Jack always said, all high names are one name, and that's my attitude as well. I see it as a complete unit. Whether you're looking at the Metatron, GD, the big GD, the small GD, whichever way you really want to look at it, I see it as a whole unit. I don't see it as a separate unit at all. I see it as a total construct within itself.
There is no part of me that is not of the gods.
Yeah, but that's holographic business, also semiology to a certain extent. There you have it.
All right, we're going to wrap it up, and so that's it. The next one will be on the correspondence course and all of the stuff that you developed.
That's going to be interesting.
Yeah. All right.
Okay. Yep.